You're watching the Metaphysical Mentor podcast with Michael Philpott. Thank you. And you know what? We've been trying to get this podcast together since December, and you were working on a movie. Was that correct?
Yeah. Hey, half my income is movie related, and it's probably difficult for any book writer to earn a living these days without having, a foot in the movie business in one capacity or another.
Yeah.
So I've always been very fortunate to have an interesting balancing act going on, and even though I'm not technically in the movie business, I option a lot of stories. I work on screenplays. I work on all kinds of things.
Yeah. Could you tell us? Can you just kind of tell us what you were working on, or?
Well, most recently, I've been working on a Cayce documentary, and I've been sort of going out of my way to visit all of the places Edgar lived and worked. And I've done that before. I just didn't do it with a movie camera. And it's also been probably 2 decades since I made a tour through all of the places that Edgar Cayce lived and worked. And that was really eye-opening because, as they like to say, the past is never how you left it. And you see things with all kinds of new sensibilities. And of course, I've been living with the Cayce story now for several decades. And like the Cayce trance readings themselves, the longer you live with it, the more things you find within it. It's an exploration.
Yeah, it certainly was. So, I mean, you probably get this question a lot, but of all the different people you could write about, how did you end up writing about Edgar Cayce?
Well, it certainly wasn't on my list. The woman I was dating, the woman I was desperately in love with, was a big Cayce fan. And that was really the big problem of our early relationship, because we had this terrible tug of war. And I was convinced that anybody who put their faith in a psychic ought to visit a psychiatrist. I mean, I was so far away from having anything to do with that kind of thing. But, I loved her so much, and I respected her, and she, otherwise seemed sensible enough. But we kept this tug of war going, and I was ghostwriting, and we were headed into Washington to interview Gerald Ford for a project. I've done a lot of ghostwriting over the years, and we decided we'd go to Virginia Beach, which is sort of like the world headquarters of Edgar Cayce.
Yeah, it's like Mecca or something.
Exactly. It's where he lived the last decade or so of his life, and today houses the Cayce Library, and a lot of the Cayce papers, all kinds of things. And so I went there really with the intention of proving to Nancy the error of her ways. And I really was convinced that if you look long and hard enough at these so-called trance readings, they wouldn't hold up. That the stories told about Cayce had been embellished over the years, and that if you really just stopped and took one of these readings piece by piece, and I was, she gave me enough rope to hang myself, because I imagined I'd step into the Cayce Library, and in a few minutes, a few hours, I would find one of these readings that would just unravel. But that wasn't the case. And so after the first week, I just got more and more perplexed. I think anybody who really stops to examine the readings themselves finds themselves in that situation. Eventually we got into the archive, and that's really where I really had to face the reality that there was much more to this than I ever imagined. The first thing that I guess touches you are the sheer volume of these readings. Cayce didn't give 50, 100, 500 of these readings in the course of his career, but closer to probably 20,000.
Really, that many?
Of which we have well over 14,000. We have verbatim transcripts of those readings. So this wasn't a kind of one-off thing. And then, of course, what hits you is the specificity of those readings. It's not sort of these vague, ambiguous statements that you often associate with psychics, but specifics, names, dates, places, body parts, blood temperature, things that are really difficult to fabricate. Then of course the internal consistency, and by this I mean readings that Cayce gave back in the 1920s are consistent with things he said 40 years later, or at least 30 years later, such that it makes you wonder how, if this was a fabrication, if this was fraud, how without a computer, without a database to go back and search, how you could keep it all straight. Yeah. And the conclusion was, and I think anybody who really makes that study, you stop asking yourself, did Edgar Cayce do what he is said to have done? Because the evidence truly is overwhelming. And you start asking, well, how did he do it? And, I mean, that's dropping down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, it's amazing. I always seem to be it never continues to fascinate me how many readings and how many different subjects, that everything that we know today about spirituality, about, metaphysical stuff, everything is basically in the Cayce readings. And I had John Van Auken on, and I asked him about this. There's a lot of people in this day and age that really still don't know who Edgar Cayce was. And I have a lot of people that I've worked with over the years, and they go, who's that guy? And I was like, really? I mean, like, he's like the OG of all psychics and holistic health. Like, how could you not know about this gentleman? Through your research, did you find people still like that wouldn't be able to, like, who's this Edgar Cayce guy?
Yes, but they know the influence. They may not know any specifics about him, and his name may still be sort of vague out there, but he started the whole, what we would term today as the New Age movement. And so much of even how psychics operate today, is a result of the Cayce readings themselves. So even if you don't know anything about the Cayce readings, it certainly has impacted you. And I think popularity in Cayce goes up and down. I think today we're on the cusp of a whole new generation rediscovering Cayce. When I first started this research, I think the biggest disappointment to me was that Cayce, had passed on, that I would never get one of these readings myself, and I was always sort of late to the party. However, as I've experienced the Cayce work, I realized that today you can do things, you can study the Cayce work in ways that just weren't possible in Cayce's day. I mean, we have it all on computer databases. We can do Boolean searches. So you can, for example, breast cancer. You can see all of the different readings Cayce gave for breast cancer in the order in which they were given, and for the types of patients that received them. You can study this work in ways you could never do before. One of the big advantages that Nancy, who became my wife, and I, we worked on this together. is being able to put names to these readings numbers. When you're first being introduced to the Cayce readings, if you want to see the readings themselves, the identity of those reading recipients remains hidden. You're given a number, 476, for example, to identify that particular reading. And this is because in Cayce's lifetime, it was a patient-physician kind of relationship, you know, and even with especially with the famous people Cayce gave readings for. George Gershwin, for example, doesn't want it being known that he's been treated for hemorrhoids or a heart condition. So, you know, there are very legitimate reasons for keeping the identity of those recipients hidden. However, the vast majority, well over 95% of reading recipients have now passed on. So the confidentiality really doesn't apply in the same way. And then as soon as you can identify who a particular reading recipient has been and study that person and their life in relation to the reading that they received, whole new insights can come out of those readings that you weren't aware before.
Yeah, if you give an example of that.
Yeah, a classic example is Lamar Jones, you know, 476. And it's a kind of reading you get to and you just blow past the reading. This is somebody who keeps asking for inscriptions. And it's not really clear why that person is asking for inscriptions. And Cayce comes back sometimes with a verse from the Bible or even just suggestions. But then if you realize that that's for Lamar Jones, and Lamar Jones is one of the most famous tombstone cutters in Selma, Alabama, and you realize that Lamar Jones is famous throughout Alabama and Mississippi for these spectacular gravestones and the inscriptions on it, which somehow capture the spirit of that person who has passed on. Then you suddenly start seeing all kinds of really interesting new things that are coming through in these readings. And then if you dig a little further, you discover, oh my gosh, Lamar Jones is Edgar Cayce's favorite fishing buddy. And oh my God, Lamar Jones is the godfather to the Cayce children. You know, all of a sudden those readings take on a much more import. What's another example I love? Mamie Gray. Okay, this is, I don't know why I'm thinking Selma, Alabama. Cayce lived for a few years in Selma, Alabama, and visited there just, you know, a month or so ago. And so it's been on my mind a lot. And, but Mamie Gray was a student of his in Bible study at the church. And everyone knew at that church that Cayce had this sort of sideline, that he was not only a photographer, but he gave these trance readings, and some had more courage than others to ask for a reading themselves. And Mamie Gray, well, Cayce came to her attention because her uncle had received this bizarre reading at the time about organ transplants. I mean,
Oh, wow.
you know, so this is, you know, 19, probably 21. And Cayce's talking about organ transplants.
Wow.
And so her uncle didn't make that leap, but he was certainly on the family radar screen. And then she got this reading for breast cancer. And again, it was one of these really strange readings. And it suggested that her husband raise a particular type of rabbit, and that you could skin the rabbit in such a way that there was a sort of fatty tissue which you could put like a compress against her breast. And these with certain other treatment recommendations. And because of her uncle's reading, she just went ahead and did it. And she also went ahead and did it because she knew she really didn't have another choice, that she was going to lose her breasts and she didn't want to get a mastectomy. And she did it, and she got, she got healthy. But in doing that, it opened up a whole okay, I don't know how to best describe this, other than I've begun to look at the Cayce readings as one would look at a family tree. And if you have Cayce in the middle, you see Mamie Gray here, and then you have her aunt, Mary Butler, who is in a mental institution. And she got a reading that if you're familiar with the Cayce work, her reading is very famous because she was suffering from an impacted wisdom tooth. And Cayce, just seemingly out of the blue, says, well, you remove the wisdom tooth and she'll be sane and you can take her out of the hospital. And that's what the family did. So you have these, family trees, and you can view the work as growing along these family trees. And at the same time, you realize how interconnected all of these readings are. And I'm saying this because this is a whole area of study in the Cayce work that just wasn't possible 30 or 40 years ago. It was inconceivable. And in doing it, you begin to see parallels, connections. You get to see some of the bigger picture, which was not evident in Cayce's time. And here's a classic example of where I'm going with this.
Yeah, please.
The Wizard of Oz.
The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah, the movie. So let's say you go on the Cayce database and you Google Wizard of Oz. What you'll find is a reference in one letter out of thousands that this guy has gone to see the movie Wizard of Oz and loved it. Oh, isn't this interesting? However, if you start putting names to these numbers and you start understanding who these people were, you start putting the readings themselves in the context in which they were given, you discover, oh my gosh, the screenwriter of Wizard of Oz is obsessed with Edgar Cayce. Oh, and this Munchkin too had readings. Oh, and the producer's wife received 15 readings. And the cameraman, and then you begin to put all of these on all together, and you start looking at them, and what you discover is that who or what is coming through Cayce really wants this movie to get made. I mean, it's, okay, I'm not wise enough to see into whatever, is going on behind the scenes, but you begin to see how who or what comes through Cayce has some sort of agenda. And it's not just a movie, it's a type of car, it's a type of car engine. And Cayce gives all of these readings to car manufacturers, and you start putting those together, and you see that, right before World War II gets started, who or what's coming through Cayce is trying to get a car manufactured.
Wow.
And if one manufacturer doesn't get on the Cayce bandwagon, the information is given to another. And so anyway, all kinds of really fascinating new insights. Another, I'm sorry, I just get really enthusiastic.
No, it's okay. Please, this is one of the things I wanted to have you on. And, one of the things I was really curious about is, your own relationship to Casey. Like, okay, I mean, you're talking about everybody else who's had readings and things like that. Have you kind of gone back and done some research with yourself and your wife to figure out, because now you're still promoting this after all these years, you're still involved in the Casey readings. Have you done any research in your past, maybe even a past life connection with Edgar Cayce?
Well, yeah, I know where you might be going, but you know, if anyone in our family has had a Casey connection, it's more my wife than myself. However, um, I really think it's because she was so, you know, steadfastly certain of the truth of these readings, and I was just the opposite. That together we were able to do things and go places, you know, that other people didn't. And when I say it's dropping down the rabbit hole, it so deeply is. Um, in in the 1960s, I think, when Cayce became very popular with the publication of Jess Stern's Sleeping Prophet, much of the emphasis in studying the readings was a result of Edgar Cayce's son, Hugh Lynn's, vision of what his father's work was like. You know, Edgar Cayce died in 1945. The organization which formed around him looked like it would be given up. And his son came back from World War II and gave up an academic career to try to keep his father's work alive. And a whole movement grew out of that. And then eventually the author Jess Stern came along with published a book, Sleeping Prophet, and Cayce was huge. But the Cayce we knew from the 1960s was the Cayce of his son's interests. He had, you know, two sons. One son was interested in Atlantis, so a whole bunch of research and attention was given to Atlantis. And his other son was interested in things like meditation. And so a lot of push was given to meditation. What they weren't interested in was science. And so the whole body of science readings weren't given any attention at all. There wasn't a lot of interest in what Cayce got wrong because they were so interested in trying to prove that he was right. And it's in the mistakes that you really get to see some of the most interesting aspects of trying to understand who or what is coming through. And so one of the first things that delighted me was like to start looking at some of these science readings, which are more relevant today than they've ever been before. Cayce gave a reading on how to build what you would term a perpetual motion motor, you know, something that once you got it operating, and that's not an easy thing. I mean, it's a complicated process. But according to the reading, once you got this motor going, it wouldn't stop unless you stopped it. And it would be very easy to put onto a chain drive and use to create electricity. I mean, my gosh, you know, something that would save, you know, the environment. And I mean, all kinds of really, really fascinating devices. And so I'm really excited about the potential for some of these things. The perpetual motion motor itself is, I mean, what a, I don't know, are you aware of this, these
No,
readings? Oh,
no.
yeah.
See, this is why I wanted to have you on, because I mean, after I started reading your book, because I've read the first biography with the, you know, there is
American
a river.
Prophet. Yeah.
No, I've actually read There Is a River. That was the one I first read.
Right.
And then when I started reading your thing, I was like, oh my God, there's so much I didn't know about the guy. I like all these science readings and all these different people, like these secret readings and all these inventors like Tesla,
Nikola
Edison.
Tesla, Edison. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's just mind blowing. Now, in those specific readings, did you actually find out what they were talking about, or is it just very general, basic readings? Because I always wondered, you know, how much influence that actually Cayce had and Source had on Thomas Edison's work, on Nikola Tesla's work, and whoever else he talked about. I mean, did he actually invent the light bulb, or was it Edgar Cayce? Like, you know.
No, I mean that was Edison, but you know, each of the inventors you've got to handle a little differently. Unfortunately for Edison and Tesla himself, you don't have the verbatim readings simply because it was at a very early time in Cayce's career before transcripts were being done. However, with Tesla, you have two different patents that were left in Cayce's name. So you got a pretty good guess as to what Cayce told him in trance. But you know, Tesla was, of course, very, very interested in electricity, as Thomas Edison was too. But Tesla in particular was interested in how to transmit energy. And it was a really interesting character, 440, that's how he's identified in the readings. Well, who he is Mitchell Hastings. And Mitchell Hastings was a brilliant young engineer at Harvard University who got his first reading because he was in the process of having a nervous breakdown. Professors were dismissing this 18-year-old's theories about how crystals could be used to change frequency. And they were about to kick him out of Harvard University, and his mother, you know, Caroline, got him a Cayce reading that said, "Oh my gosh, this guy's brilliant, and hey, you've been doing this for several important incarnations, and stay at it. And oh, by the way, if your mental condition is such that you got to de-stress and you got to go to Arizona." And they actually sent him to a ranch in Bonita, Arizona. It's right there on the border, and where he de-stressed. But Mitchell Hastings would go on to graduate Harvard and design everything in the future from radio-controlled torpedoes to radio communications. And under David Sarnoff, he developed FM radio. And I mean, you can trace all these readings right back to Cayce. And you look at Bill Wilson's life and career, you know, 12-step program. People have always suspected that comes out of Cayce, but we've never been able to prove it. Bill Wilson isn't listed as one of those people who ever had readings. However, you dig a little deeper and you realize that Irene Seiberling did. And Irene Seiberling was one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you go visit Irene Seiberling's house in Akron, Ohio, in the guest book, you'll discover, oh, Edgar Cayce is a frequent visitor to that. Oh, and then if you look at who was visiting that guest house, was Edgar Cayce, and literally within 10 days later, Bill Wilson is there, and they're founding, that was the founding meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Wow.
So anyway, I know we're going off in all different directions.
That's okay. Listen, it's so fascinating. Listen, Sidney, we can go, like, I mean, if you only got 50 minutes, I can go for an hours. Like,
oh yeah, take as long as you like. I love talking about this stuff.
It's a fantastic topic, and it's so, again, I'm just in awe. I'm just listening to this, and I'm just eating it all up because I just found it so fascinating. Is there anything right now? Are you doing anything? You know how you had that, you know, that family tree, that lineage of all these different people that have been affected and created something like this. How far forward is it being still affected? So I'm trying to figure out. Okay, so let's say he did a reading in 1920, this person had a reading, it affected this person, it has now invented this. Is it still, even till today, people still being influenced in that way, that type of lineage? Have you gone like almost like a time timestamp or time continuation?
What a great question that is. That's a really interesting subject. And it's not easily answered because you've got to look at the different types of readings Cayce gave. Certainly from the medical side of things, as most of your listeners know, there were some 9,000 or so medical readings, and things that were dismissed as ludicrous concepts back when Cayce gave them have since proven out to be true. Just in the last 10 years or so, there have been major breakthroughs that people who imagined where some of the Cayce recommendations were still considered fantasy are now being proven out using today's technology. Epilepsy is a wonderful example. Cayce back in the 20s and 30s said epilepsy was not a mental condition. Cayce describes epilepsy as in your problem oftentimes in your abdomen, that there are neurotransmitters in your abdomen that have been damaged, and because they're damaged, they will start sending white noise to your brain, and that's how you get an epileptic fit.
Wow.
Cayce further said that people who are particularly gifted with their hands, sensitives, one might say Reiki people today, though I don't think Cayce ever used the term Reiki. I think it was before his time. Maybe you can tell me more accurately on this, but Cayce said there are people who would be able to run their hands over someone's abdomen and pick up cold spots, and that once you identified where the cold spot existed, you could treat that spot, and in the healing of treating that spot where the neurotransmitter was. Anyway, a group did a study in Miami 8 or 9 years ago where they took a bunch of a test group of epileptics and a control group, and they used a new type of device which can measure extraordinarily minor temperature changes. And so they photographed these people, and sure enough, all the epileptics had these, or all the female epileptics had these cold spots.
Wow.
And the directors of the study had no idea who Edgar Cayce was. And so that's what made it all the more exciting. And so you've got that going on, and you've got several other interesting studies like psoriasis, for example. Cayce said psoriasis was not a skin condition per se, but it was a result of the thinning of the walls of your lower intestines and your colon, and that toxins were leaching out and having to come out of the system some way, and they were coming up through your skin. So that if you wanted to be treated for psoriasis, you started with a change of diet and dietary things. Today, if you leave the pharmaceutical aspect of psoriasis out of the equation, doctors will say exactly that that's what psoriasis is. And so what I'm seeing, and this is get back to answer to your question, there's a device Cayce gave. It's one of these science devices, and it's given great descriptions in how to build one of these devices. It's a way of, gosh.
Is that the rebalancing?
It's a way of delivering a medication by analyzing its particular frequencies of a medication and delivering it directly into your system electronically. And this was like a device out of something they might have described Frankenstein back in the 30s. But today, gosh, it's a sort of magnetic resonance device. And so I know this is being studied right now. How cool is that? Just how wonderful. So we are, but in answer to your question, are the grandchildren of these people embracing their readings? And I would say by and large, no. Okay. But as I keep saying over and over, because the truth of these readings are being revealed, and we're able to start seeing things in a little grander way, or at least the bigger picture, it promises to take our understanding of psychic phenomena in a whole different course than it was in the 50s and 60s. I'm reminded of this with the Burton Wheeler readings. By putting names to numbers, you understand now that a man running against FDR, Senator Burton Wheeler, was running against FDR for president of the United States. And these readings themselves are fascinating insights into what makes a good president, what responsibilities that good president has. And of course, you lose all of that stuff if you don't realize that the person receiving this reading, is running actively for the president of the United States. And this was one of those series of readings that was considered wrong, considered a mistake. Edgar Cayce in the reading says this person should become the president of the United States, if only, or if that is his decision. And since we know that Burton Wheeler really was running and didn't, FDR was president, my gosh, Cayce had to have been wrong. But now we know that from Burton Wheeler's papers, that FDR was begging Burton Wheeler to become his vice presidential running mate. And isn't it interesting to imagine if Burton Wheeler had said, yes, well, I'll do that, because he would have been president, because FDR died in IFAS. And isn't it interesting to compare Burton Wheeler with Harry Truman? Harry Truman, of course, we know, dropped the atomic bomb. Yeah. Burton Wheeler was a pacifist. He was a Quaker. He was dedicated to trying to keep us out of World War II. And he was a compassionate individual with great empathy. And wouldn't it have been interesting if he had become vice president, and then, the FDR dies, and then he's left with the position of dropping the atomic bomb? How different our world would have been.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about the readings. It's always like the what ifs. What if this particular person? What if this happened? And there's always that sense of free will, because I know Edgar Cayce talked a lot about, the free will. And, obviously it was his free will and choice not to become that. But you always think, and then another person I had on the show was Joanne DiMaggio, and she talked about the gentleman, I forget his name, but the gentleman who was a reincarnation.
T.J. Davis.
Yes, and that's a prime example. What if this guy became who he had in that reading? Like, that would have been so amazing. Like, he was, an incarnated of Alexander the Great, Thomas Jefferson, and then now he could have been even a better person in this incarnation if he chose to do it, but he just decided not to do it. So I just find it, it's pretty cool. Interesting stuff. So if I had to ask you, what is the one thing that you've learned from all this? Like, you're still down that rabbit hole, Casey. What has really significantly changed in your life, in your own thought process about these readings?
Well, that's easily answered. When I first dove down this Cayce rabbit hole, I was firmly of the belief that this was Cayce's work, that it was his work. And I was looking at it as something somehow different than our work. And then you dig into it a little further, and you realize, oh, well, you've got these medical readings, and you've got these past life readings, and you've got the vocation readings, and then you have an assortment of others, and you keep them all separate. And then eventually you begin to discover that you really can't understand the medical readings until you understand the Atlantis readings, until you understand the reincarnation readings, and you start putting them all together. And then you realize that Edgar Cayce couldn't do what he did alone. I mean, it's interesting, as your listeners probably know, how he went into trance evolved over a period of years. And that he needed help. He needed someone to help put him into trance. He needed a dedicated stenographer to take down what he was saying. And he needed a bunch of others to figure out what he was saying oftentimes. But most important, he needed someone who desperately needed help, someone who genuinely needed help. And you study some of these readings, and you really realize that if you genuinely want this help from this man, what comes through is far richer, much more detailed than, if you're on a little fishing trip. But throughout all of that, you get a sense of the team that was around Cayce, and how it was a real mistake to look at this as just one man's work. That all of these were important participants in this, and the same is true for us. That it's this soul group that comes together. You don't accomplish what you come down to do alone. You accomplish it in a team. T.J. Davis didn't himself fail. The team around him, his mom and dad were alcoholics. Throughout all of these readings, I begin seeing how the people formed these units around the people who had readings, and very often they all had readings, and they were all working together. And that some of those groups really succeeded in very, very serious ways, and others failed. And I think the same can be said with us. There's probably more groups that failed in the Cayce readings than succeeded, but those that did succeed have succeeded in brilliant, wonderful ways. And so I think this teaches us to be open to soul groups, and open to understanding that we're working together. And it's certainly something Nancy and I have realized, that in our working together, our work together, has brought, has greatly helped our, understanding, of how all of this works. I mean, I was I was on the bestseller list when I first met Nancy, and I was just so full of myself. I didn't need any help. I knew what I was doing, and I knew that psychic phenomena was all BS, and so I had to be taken down several notches here. And it's interesting, my mom, who really helped a great deal with my career. Our first Cayce book was the first one of these books that she never read. She wouldn't read it. She said, you're destroying your career. You're poised for a Pulitzer, and what do? You're just jumping off the deep end. And of course I was jumping off the deep end, but I'm so glad I did.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like it's a continuation of this journey that you're on. And I mean, you started out starting out as a writer, and now you're a little bit more than a writer. You're a biographer. You're make movies and things like that. But it's just the evolution of what you're doing with the Cayce readings. When you speak about it, I can look at that and honestly say that it's part of your soul now. It's so much in depth in you, and
Yeah.
it's such a privilege to listen to you talk about it, because I could just sit here and just grab a glass.
I don't know if you can see this.
What you got showing there?
Well, I'm going to say another aspect is I've got my hair, the Cayce treatment for hair loss. It's called crudoleum. And,
No.
this is wicked stuff. It's grade 5 Pennsylvania crude oil, and there's sort of, the idea is you put some on a tablespoon, you massage it into your scalp.
Oh.
And if you look at my early books, my hairline is receding back, back, back. And then you look at Cayce and it goes forward, forward, forward. And it's this stuff. And, I joke around a lot about this. I just happen to have this in my bathroom and I picked it up. But it's sort of like a good news and bad news. The good news is that it really works. The bad news is that it reeks of such odor, that it's a sort of form of birth control, because nobody will want to go to bed with you.
So, okay, that particular product, is that something that you can purchase at the ARE or on the?
Yeah, you can purchase the ARE, the Heritage Store. You can go on Amazon and get it. A Cayce purveyor of products who will actually give you a great interview is called Bruce Barr, B-A-A-R, Barr Products. And he just does Cayce, mostly health treatments, but he does all kinds of other stuff too. And, Bruce is in Pennsylvania, and he and his wife, Kathy, they've given, their entire lives to his Cayce stuff. And they're probably the best, best way to, if you're interested in especially medical treatments, what Cayce had to say and how it's used, they're good people to go to.
Okay, so what I'll do for all my listeners there, once we have this interview over, I'll make sure that I get that information and I'll put that in the description below. So I'll put Bruce's information in the description below, so you can just kind of scroll down, look at it, check out the website. So if you're interested in these holistic health practices and all that stuff, you can give them a call. So just want to switch topics there for a second. So your wife, Nancy, she's Canadian, and we talked about this. Yeah. Is she from the Toronto area? Where is she from originally?
Yeah. From, off and on. Her whole life is in and around the Toronto area. She went to U of T, and it's interesting because both of us, this is both our second marriage, and both of us were married to film directors. And hers took hers from, Toronto to Berlin to New York to LA, and mine took me from New York to LA, and they promptly left us. And we found each other, and but we still have we own an inn in Ontario, the Portage Inn.
Yeah, I checked it
out. Right outside of Huntsville.
Yeah, that's a beautiful area, and I checked it out. I was like, wow, that's really cool. So when did you guys purchase that?
Oh, I don't know, 8-9 years ago, maybe even longer than that.
Yeah.
With COVID, it's hard to run from a distance. And it's Nancy does 99% of the work. When I'm there, I chop wood, carry water, that kind of thing. But it's really her business, and she comes from a very large Canadian family. They have enough to make their own hockey team, and so we initially were looking at this as a place we could retire to, which of course, buying an old inn is not a thing you should. That was like I needed my head examined. That's no retirement, but it was a big enough where her entire family could come visit and stay for days or weeks at a time.
Yeah,
I love it. I mean, Canada, that part of Muskoka is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah,
all of Muskoka is.
Yeah,
and Canadians are just like great.
Yeah, well, thanks, brother. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's a beautiful place now. Is it still be able to rent right now, or is it just closed
Yeah,
down?
yeah. It's shut down in the winter. It's just too cold to keep it heated, and we now mostly rent by the week, and we rent the whole place out. Because you can sleep 25, 30 people, and so groups get together.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place there. So I'll put that in the description too, just in case Nancy needs some people too. That hopefully this whole COVID thing will just kind of blow over finally, eventually. This is where I wish Edgar Cayce was alive today to kind of tell us, okay, what's going on with this COVID stuff, to give us a reading for this and kind of get, let's get this thing over with, because I'm pretty well done with it. We're in another lockdown here in Toronto again.
Yeah.
Gosh, stuff's crazy. Well, that being said, my brother, we're almost out of time.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Have me on anytime. There's nothing I like better than talking about Cayce.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Well, I mean, you got so many other books and real cool stuff. I was looking at the other book titles about the hidden treasures of the Nazis, and I thought that's like, I mean, that sounds pretty cool, like a Indiana Jones type thing.
Yeah, Spear of Destiny, and I've also ghost written a bunch of books and a lot of true crime books. Well, many roads end up leading back to Cayce, and it's hard to escape. Like, are you familiar with what the Spear of Destiny was?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that. Yeah, it was the spear that the Roman soldier used to kill Christ. Yeah, and it's supposed to have these magical powers.
Right. Well, so when I jumped into that story, my intention was to tell the whole history of Christianity through the symbol of that spear, as opposed to like the Holy Grail or something, or how the spear of Longinus, the spear of destiny, changed how Christianity was viewed. And publishers weren't the least bit interested in the story of the whole Christianity. They just wanted to know how Hitler went after it and George Patton got it away from him. And I sold that story, only I hadn't researched that part of the story, because I was thinking to tell the whole Christianity, 2,000 years. We're going to tell, 8-10 year period. And as I got into it, it took a long time, almost 6 months, to find out who General Patton had put in charge of finding it. And then I was desperate because there were no papers around, and I was getting really uptight, because here I had contracted to write this book, and I had less than 15 pages of material to base it on, and just as I was melting down, I eventually tracked it to a woman in Northern California, the widow of this soldier, and it took a long time to get through to her. And then I discovered she had a trunk of papers.
Oh,
and
wow.
oh man, this is great, but she didn't want to give them to me. And so I went, tried to sell myself, and I went in front of her whole family, 2 daughters, a son, grandchildren, who were quizzing me. And I never talk about Edgar Cayce first, because you don't know how people are going to react. And then one of the granddaughters, said, "Well, didn't you also write this book about Edgar Cayce? Do you really believe all that stuff?" And I won't go into the specifics, but the widow got on the phone to somebody and said, right in front of me, I said, "Well, you ever heard of this Sidney Kirkpatrick guy? He wants Walter's papers." And I only heard half the conversation, but it turned out to be a dedicated Edgar Cayce fan who, of course, knew who I was, and the rest is history.
Wow.
So I don't know. So I keep getting pushed back into this.
Wow, it just never stops. I guess once you got a hold of it, and he's influencing everybody from the other side still. So I really appreciate you being on the show. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Love it. So I'm just going to close off the podcast here, Sidney. So this has been the Metaphysical Mentor Podcast with Michael Philpott. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Michael.
For now. Goodbye.